Pierre Barlow was a gunner in Fort Valérien during the Prussian siege on Paris. One day he was standing by his gun when General Noel, his commander, walked up to him and leveled his glass on the Sèvres Bridge. "Gunner," he said, "do you see the bridge over there?" "Yes, I do, sir." He said, "Do you see the little shanty in the shrubs to the left?" "I see it, sir," he said, turning a little pale. "Gunner," he said, "it's a nest of Prussians. Try it, test it with a shell." During turning paler, Pierre sighted his glass deliberately and carefully and fired. "Well done," said the commander. "Well hit." But he was surprised to see a tear running down the cheek of his gunner. "What is the matter, man?" he asked him. He said, "Pardon me, General, that was my house. That's all I had in this world." The price of obedience sometimes can be quite high. You know, the F-16 fighter jet is an amazing aircraft. It's incredible, and it can do a whole lot of things. And there's one thing the jet pilot needs more than anything else. The aircraft reacts completely to his control. If that jet had a mind of its own, regardless of how remarkable it is and how great it is, it wouldn't do much flying, any more flying than a doorstop. Likewise, if we are gifted, the greatest gifted under the sun, God, as the ultimate pilot of our lives, will only do amazing and remarkable things with our lives if we are fully under his control. If we insist on taking things in our life into our own hands, taking opportunities, doing with them what we want, we will be as effective as the proverbial doorstop. And less gifted men and women that are more humble than I or than that person, God will use to get his tasks done. Obedience is the key to life. It is the key to joy, and to excellence. Every conscientious parent here knows how difficult it is to exercise our God-given authority over our children. The delicate balance between being tough and yet tender is not easy to maintain. Many parents intensify a rebellious spirit by being dictatorial or harsh. Other parents just yield when their authority is tested. And you might be part of one of those, I don't know. But neither one works well in raising children. When a strong-willed child resists, the pressure to give in for the sake of peace and harmony is almost overwhelming. It kind of reminds me of a mother I read about that always wanted the last word, but couldn't handle the hassle that resulted every time she told her child no. After an especially trying day, she flung her arms in the air and shouted, "All right, Billy, do whatever you want." And then she added, "Now let me see you disobey that." You know, Israel, the children of God, struggled with obedience. Hearing what God wanted from them, they ultimately turned and did what they wanted to do, and oftentimes got way ahead of God and his plan for them. In the end, they even tried sometimes to blame God for it. But the truth known, they were disobedient to God, and they got the consequences of their actions. There is a price to pay for disobedience also. Paul says about Israel, he said, these things happened to them as an example, but were written down for our instruction or our learning, on whom the end of the ages has come. So what can we learn from them this morning? You know, Israel didn't always like listening or even receiving commandments from God. But I think it's even worse today. People do not want to hear that God commands us to do things. And I even had a person tell me, if he's a commanding God, then he doesn't love us. But we have a loving God, so he doesn't command us. Now, I don't know where that reasoning comes from, but it's not reasoning, not very sound reasoning. God gave Israel 2 commandments before they were going to enter the promised land. The first one he gave them was very simple. It was very straightforward. Exodus 23 and verse 31. God says, I will set your borders from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines and from the wilderness of the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of that land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. There's the command. Doesn't sound that difficult. You got God on your side. You're good to go. I have to tell you, I'm with Joshua and Caleb on this. Joshua and Caleb came back after spying out the people in the land, and 10 other spies went with them. And the 10 of them came back and said, oh, those guys are too big. They're too mighty. They got walled cities. We can't do it. And Joshua and Caleb said, what's wrong with you guys? God's with us. We got nothing to fear. Let's go take them. So when God says, I'm with you, I'm helping you, he says, I'm going to drive them out before you, or I'll use you to do it, but I'm the one that's the force behind all of that. You shouldn't question. It should just be a joyous victory in your heart. But Israel didn't keep their eyes on God, so they rebelled, and they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. In fact, God said, none of you that rebel today, that are here, that are over 19 years old, will see the promised land. And they all died in the wilderness because of their disobedience or their rebellion or whatever you want to call it. But that command stood for that 40 years for those that were going to enter the promised land. He gave a second command. It wasn't any harder than the first one. It kind of piggybacked on the first command, and that's in verse 32 of Exodus 23. God said, you shall make no covenant with them and their gods. Okay, so put those 2 commandments together. Drive them all out. Don't make a covenant with them. Don't make a covenant with their gods. In other words, he's saying, you do not want to be associated with these people. Get rid of them. That's what I want you to do. And I'm here to help you do that. It's a no-brainer. And so he says you enter in there. Don't make an agreement with them, because if you make an agreement with them, things aren't going to work out well for you. Okay? Now, I don't know how good you are at taking commandments or listening to commandments. I don't know. I know how good our children were in listening to us tell them things they needed to do. But, and I know how some people react to Jesus telling us commandments. But logic would say, God's with us. He wants us to do this. Let's just do it. But you know, with human beings, that sometimes we like to take the easy route out. And you know, fighting people isn't always easy. It can be very difficult. So God says, here's the 2 things I want you to do. Now, we know God doesn't do anything without purpose or reason. He does everything with purpose and reason. He's rational, he's logical, he's methodical, and he doesn't do mindless things just for exercise and entertainment. That's not who God is. He also knows that Israel will fail him just like they did many times in the wilderness. He knows our nature. You know, they complained. They doubted. They shrank back when they should have pressed forward. They tried to do things their way instead of listening to him. They even tried to steal from him. Achan's sin. So Those were his people. Moses said, man, they're yours, God. They're not mine. They're your people. And God said, yeah, and they're stiff-necked. Do you know what stiff-necked is? Stiff-necked is obstinate, stubborn, headstrong, strong-willed, self-willed, pig-headed, bull-headed. I think you get the picture. That's what stiff-necked is. So those are some of the things that God saw in his people, and they just kind of proved him right time and time again. It's no wonder that God just, it's a wonder he didn't just leave them the commandment. I mean, it's no wonder he didn't just leave them the commandment. He said, listen, guys, I gave you these commandments, and now I'm going to give you a warning. Because I think you need the warning too. I have people tell me that it's always nice to know the reason you're doing something, why you're doing it, and all of that. It makes it so much easier to do the task when you understand the result that is to come, or the desired effort. And people that don't see that often don't want to obey the commandment. God tells them in Exodus 23 and 33, the reason I want you to obey my commandments, the reason you need to listen to them is this. If those inhabitants continue to live in the land, they will make you sin against me, and they will entice you to serve their gods, and their gods will become a snare to you. Does that sound like something you'd want? Nah. God says the reason for driving him out is so you don't get caught up in the sin of those inhabitants that are living in that land, the idolatry, the worshiping of the created and the creation rather than the creator. That seems to be sound logic and reasoning, I think. Like we learned over the last 3 weeks with the temptations of Jesus. If we don't put ourselves in a position of being tempted, it saves us a whole lot of hassle. And that's what God's saying. He's saying, I'm saving you a whole lot of trouble of temptation. I'm just going to drive all those people out with you. We're going to drive them out, and we don't want anything to do with them. And you are going to be a lot freer. You won't have all the distractions. Well, those are the commands and the warnings. So let's see how it worked out. After wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, every Israelite who had sinned against God in the wilderness and tested him over and over had died. And so here comes Israel to the border of the promised land again. Standing with Joshua at the borders of the land, Israel that they're about to inherit, a new generation of Israelites, all who were 19 years and younger and were born after that time, during that time period, are standing there. We leave the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, and we get into the book of Joshua. Joshua takes over as commander-in-chief. Okay? And he's going to lead them across the Jordan. And so God tells Joshua, he says, tell the people that they need to be courageous and they need to be strong and be careful to do according to the law, all the law that God had given them through Moses, his servant. He says, don't turn left, don't turn right. Just do what is commanded you. So into the land they march. And at first things are going quite well. They drive them all out. They destroy the people of the land, or they drive them out. Now, I don't know about you, but I can imagine the energy and the effort that would take. Can you imagine for weeks and weeks and maybe months just pushing people out, driving them out? It'd be tough. And all the tribes, all 12 tribes helped each other, and they settled the land as they went. Now you know that these stiff-necked people, that things aren't always going to go that well. Something's going to happen. You know that. There was something amiss. Something had to go wrong. So you get to the end of Joshua, and he dies of old age. But before he dies, he pens one of the greatest and most popular quotes in Scripture. I have it on my wall at home. The people had already been collecting idols, if you can imagine, and other treasures as they were driving the people out. And they were starting to kind of worship these idols. And so Joshua comes to them and he says, I'm going to give you an ultimatum. You have to choose today. Do you serve the God of heaven? Or do you want to serve the idols of the Amorites? Your choice. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And so he makes that quote. And of course, everybody quotes that quote, but they don't know what it's related to necessarily. Joshua dies. The people are tired of fighting. The people are tired of all of this stuff that they have to go through, pushing these people out. And so they say, well, it won't hurt to compromise a little, right? I mean, and some of these people, they seem to be really nice people. Why are we doing this? Judges 1 and verse 27 and following, you read, and Manasseh did not drive out, and Ephraim did not drive out, and Zebulun did not drive out, and Asher did not drive out, Naphtali did not drive out, and Joseph submitted them to forced labor. What Israel did is instead of driving them out now, they're saying, we're going to make you our slaves. You think that came from anywhere? Remember way back in Egypt? They were slaves. So they started thinking, it wouldn't be half bad to keep some of these people around and do the work so we don't have to do the work. They'd be our slaves. And so they start implementing their thinking. Their disobedience to God came at a price. They failed to obey the commandment of God. Now, I don't think we have a right to beat them up too badly, because I would wager that everybody in here has disobeyed a commandment or two of God's. But we should learn from it. The angel of the Lord comes to visit the people of Israel, but the message that he has for them is not pleasant. He's speaking on God's behalf. He says, I, the Lord, have done all this for you. I gave you the land. I gave you 2 commandments to follow and obey. And I saved you from slavery in Egypt. I've kept my promise I made with your forefathers. I told you I would never break my covenant with you. I gave you all of this. And I warned you. I warned you not to give in to these people, not to make a covenant with these people. I told you to drive them out completely and break down their altars. And don't keep their idols as souvenirs for treasures. They're not treasures. I told you all of this. But you disobeyed my voice. You disobeyed my commandments. What have you done? You see, they had no reason to obey. They had every reason, or to disobey. They had every reason to obey. God gave them everything. He fought for them. He looked after them. He nurtured them. And he cared for them all the way through. But that just wasn't enough. Kind of like people today. It's just not enough. Because we are kind of drawn in by the treasures of this world. And we lose our focus on God sometimes. Speaking through the angel, God says, like I promised you, and I keep all my promises, and you know I keep my promises, I will no longer drive those people out from before you. Instead, like I told you, they will become a thorn in your side, and their gods a snare to you. That is the consequence. That is the price of disobedience. They were free and clear with God. And they got trapped in idols and all of those things. The people knew that they were in trouble. And it says that they all cried. They all wailed and wept because of the consequences. but they could have been living in peace. They suffered a loss of a relationship with God that they had because they weren't willing to obey him. Disobedience comes at a great price. And so what is the lesson for us as Christians in all of that? Because some people just can't relate to what Israel went through back then. So let's bring it over to today. First of all, you and I have the same God. Exact same God. He is the Father in heaven, and he's made a covenant with us. He has made it through his Son, Jesus Christ, who was willing to die on the cross to save us from our sin. And Jesus said, if you keep my commandments, you obey them, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. And you can take the opposite of that as truth as well. The opposite is, if you do not keep my commandments, you do not abide in my love, but in my wrath. Because that's the consequence. So he's given us that, but he's also given us plenty of warnings in Scripture to obey his commandments. People today want to do whatever they want to do. They want to believe whatever they want to believe about God. Not necessarily what God says about himself, but believe what they think about God. And that somehow down the road, it doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter if I obey or don't obey, or if I just do my own thing, or whatever I do. Somehow down the road, God's going to rubber stamp me and say, I'm okay, I'm saved. Well, that's not going to work. You know, people are living in immorality, and they think God's okay with that. People are living in idolatry, and they think God's okay with that. They're lying and cheating and stealing, and they think God's okay with that. That's not true, folks. That couldn't be farther from the truth. You and I not only have the same promise attached to obeying God's commandments when it comes to the rewards, but we have the same promises when it comes to disobedience. If we want life in Christ Jesus, like Israel had with God in heaven before they disobeyed, we need to obey his commandments and not question. A Persian legend says that a certain king needed a faithful servant. So he chose two candidates for the office. He took both and he gave them a fixed wage. And he said, your first order will be to fill a basket with water from the neighboring well, saying he would come in the evening and check out their work. After putting in 1 or 2 bucketfuls, one man said, what is the good of doing this useless work? As soon as we put the water in one side, it runs out the other side of the basket. The other man answered and said, but we have our wages, don't we? The use is the master's business, not ours. I'm not going to do this foolish work, replied the other one. Throwing down his bucket, he went away. The other man continued until he had exhausted the well. Looking down into the bottom of the well, he saw something shining, a diamond ring. And he said, now I see the purpose of pouring the water in the basket. If we had dipped up the ring in one of the buckets of water, it would have stayed in the basket and we would have found the ring. Makes sense to me. It is not our place as Christians to question the sanity of anything or the worth of anything that God commands us to do. You know, I get a little bit of a laugh out of this. Some people come to me and say, how do I love my enemy? Jesus said I have to love my enemy. How do I love my enemy? Well, I tell them how to love their enemy, but Jesus said we do that. I'm not supposed to question how smart that is, how smart I think it is, or how moral I think it is, or right or wrong, or whatever. That's none of my business. Because our divine master knows best. And what he requires of us is to trust and obey him. And in due time, we will know and we will understand exactly what his purpose was for everything. And you can take it to the bank that it's just and right. If you need Jesus in your life this morning, please come forward and let us know how we can help you with that while we stand and sing.
When we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he sheds on our way. While we do his good will, he abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Not a shadow can rise, not a cloud in the skies, but a smile quickly drives it away. Not a doubt nor a fear, not a sigh nor a tear can abide while we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Not a burden we bear, not a sorrow we share, but our toil he doth richly repay. Not a grief nor a loss, not a frown nor a cross, but is blessed if we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. But we never can prove the delights of his love until all on the altar we lay. For the favor he shows and the joy he bestows are for those who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. And then in fellowship sweet, we will sit at his feet, or will walk by his side in the way. What he says we will do, where he sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and